the first thing that we want to do, just to save bandwidth, I've already downloaded all of the different things that are necessary to get started. We've got a couple different bits and pieces here that I'll be walking through. But the first thing we really want to do is go to a root directory on one of our drives. In this case, I'm using my C drive, but if you have like external drives like a F or E drive, that would also work, but there would be some differences in a couple of the steps that we're going to be doing, and I'll try and call those out as I go through it. But the first thing we want to do is create a Quake dev folder within that root directory. And then within that, we want to create a couple more things. So we want to create an id1 folder, which is where we'll be storing the game files for the base Quake game, which are necessary if we're going to be making maps for it. We want to have a tools directory where we're going to be storing all this stuff over here. And we want WADs, which is where we'll be putting our texture packs, and a working directory, which is where we will be putting our work in progress maps. Is video stuff all clear? Yeah, Shambler not. You downloaded Quark, okay. So first thing that we want to do is get our id files. So I'm assuming that you already have a copy of Quake somewhere, either through like Steam or GOG or some other way. But if you have that through Steam or similar, you want to find the id1 folder within your install of Quake and grab the pack0 and pack1 files. And these are all of the game data, the textures, the assets, and the gameplay code. And we want to copy that and bring it over to our Quake dev directory and drop that in here. And now the next thing that we want to do, just so that the game runs smoothly on our modern system, is to have a source port. So I'm going to be using Quake Spasm, but there are a bunch of other source ports that we could use. And I'm just going to copy that stuff and pull it over here. And again, download links for all of these different things are on that tutorial page. So if there's confusion about where to get Quake Spasm, hopefully that will clarify. And I think that link is available at the in the description for this stream. But cool, we've now got our id1 with our packs, and we have Quake Spasm. So now at this point we can hop in, and we should be able to run the game. And I'm going to turn on a couple settings here, like always run, and let's see, is there anything else I want? Probably some video settings so you guys can see what I'm doing. Yeah. Cool. And that we're able to jump into the start map means that everything is working. We're all happy. Cool. So now the next thing we want to do is set up our level editor. And for this, we are using TrenchBroom. So for this, let's extract the files. And we want to extract these to Quake Dev. And I'm using 7-zip to extract here because this is a 7-zip compression. I'm not sure if the base extractor or the zip tool works with 7-zips. You may need to go to the 7-zip website to get the tool to be able to extract TrenchBroom. But I'm going to extract it here to my tools directory. And now let's double check that's all happy. And I'm going to create a shortcut and put that right at the parent directory in Quake Dev. And just so it's visible right at the top, I'm going to call this editor. So it's right at the top of my list. Cool. Now at this point we can open this up. I do still have some like recent maps and stuff like that here because I have multiple copies of TrenchBroom and some of that information is saved between copies. For you, if this is your first time loading TrenchBroom, it's probably not going to look like this. Probably it's just going to be blank with the option for new map and browse. It's been a while since I've had a completely clean install of TrenchBroom. But first, let's go to New Map, and we want to create our preferences for Quake. So here we have the Quake option for our games, and we need to specify the game path. And this is to say where the game's at, the executable, which in this case is QuakeSpasm, and that also tells it where the pack files are for the game assets, so it knows what can actually be placed and used in editor. Cool, so I set it to Quake Dev. It was already set that way, but again, that's because I have multiple installs of TrenchBroom on my system. If this is your first time using it, it probably would be blank, but let's go ahead and apply and hit OK. And then let's create a new map with Quake selected here. Cool. And at this point, we are now in TrenchBroom, and we've got our first map with a very simple CSG box set up in it. And if we go over to entities, we can double check that all of the assets are being referenced correctly and everything is nice and happy. If all of these guys were marked as just like boxes instead of seeing models, then probably that means that the preferences were not set up correctly. Or if you aren't even able to load into TrenchBroom and you get like a crash message or something like that, then you want to double check that you've got the prerequisite redistributables installed. Okay. At this point though, if we create a map, we aren't going to be able to play it because we still don't have the compiler tools. I'm gonna take a second here and see. Okay, so we've got okay, yeah, so 7-zip is needed, and yeah, exclamation marks to put shortcuts at top is handy. And Tin Kelp suggestion also very useful for putting suggestions at the top. Let me see. Okay. So at this point, we now need our compiler. So again, I've installed all these things already, but that document includes links to the places you need to go. And the first thing we need is the Eric W tools, which are these guys here. So I'm just going to grab this folder and pull it over to tools. And the important thing here is the binaries. We've got a couple different compiler tools that are all separate executables. We've got the QBSP, which processes the building blocks, the BSP of the level. We've got Viz, which breaks the level down into chunks so that it's performant. And we have Light, which does the lighting pass and bakes our point lights into light map data so that we can see the lighting in the level. Right now, though, all these tools, like if we try to run this, would just, oh, well, we might get a warning. But it would just pop up a little console command line thing because it's not, there's no visual aspect to these tools, which makes it a little hard for people like me to use these tools. So what we want to do is get a graphical UI for these compilers. And there's specifically the Necros Quake 1 single player compiling GUI that we want to grab and use. All right, now if we launch this, this is basically our important compiling tools, but we've got a couple setup steps that we need to do. First thing is we need to specify our tools folder, which is where our compiling stuff is actually at. In this case, that means going to Quake Dev and going to our tools and specifically the bin or the binaries for the Eric W tools. And that will inform, hey, here's where these various executable steps are at. Then we need to go to our working folder. Let's see. And we want to go with the folder that we created earlier for our work in progress maps. And then for our output folder, we want to go to id1, and specifically we want to create a folder within id1 that is called maps. And that is where our final compiled maps will go. Cool. Now at this point we need to create a map in order to be able to compile something. The default map that it gives us here is one that I guess Necros was working on, Necros City. We also need to set the game engine to Quake Spasm. So if we go here, we should be set. All right, so that is the compiler. Next step, we want to create a really basic level. So if we go back, one thing before we do that, let's go ahead and create another shortcut. Let's call that compiler. Yep, there we go. Let's see. So let's create a new map and go for Quake. And generally it's best if we're doing any kind of complex texturing to go with Valve rather than standard map format. That determines how the textures behave on complex slope surfaces. But in this case, we're making a very simple level, so there's no real benefit of doing that. No reason not to either, but we'll just go with the standard. All right, so here we have our whole void world and we have our first block. So this block is a brush, which will be BSP or be part of a binary spatial partition, which is actually, it's more like constructive solid geometry or CSG, but these terms are all kind of messy in how they're used throughout. The first thing we want to do here is just create a basic box. So what I'm doing here, if I click and hold left mouse on this, I can move it around. If I click and hold left mouse and Alt, I can move up and down on the Z axis, which is the blue axis here. If I hold Shift, you can see that faces on this brush are highlighting as I mouse around. And what that means is if I now left click and hold, I can extend that face. Also, if I hold Control and then left click and drag, I can duplicate, which means that I can do quite a lot pretty quickly. So one thing just to start off with, we don't have a great sense, like what is 128? The unit of measurement is in terms of pixels for at least the default scale. But again, what does that exactly mean? So we want to drop in a player start, and that gives us a rough sense of how big we are as a player. And when we spawn into the map, this is going to be us, right? So with that in mind, we can now scale out this floor a bit and get an impression of just how big this space is. So again, I am holding Shift to highlight one of these faces and then left clicking and dragging to modify. And what I'm going to do here is create a pretty simple setup. We are going to have a room, and then it is going to go down a hallway, and then we are going to go to another room. So again, I am Control left clicking to duplicate, and then Shift left clicking to drag based on the highlighted face. Let's make this room square just to look nice. So we've got 448 on the one side. Cool. Now let's create some walls. If I want to, I could also increase or decrease the grid size with the plus and minus tools, or use the shortcuts that are the number keys. So if I hit 8, for example, we are now at grid 128. I could also just go through this button up here and cycle through it. So we have a number of options. One downside of the control option is that sometimes I accidentally duplicate things when I don't mean to. That's all right. All right, we now have a very simple start room and a hallway and a very simple second room here. Let's just go ahead and grab the floor, and that's to select multiple, that is Control and click without dragging. And now let's Control, Alt, click, drag to duplicate and raise up into the air so that now we have a ceiling. And let's go ahead and save this map as, let's go to our working folder and save this as my first map. Now a couple things that we want to do here. Let's go ahead and just compile this and see what happens. Okay, so going to our compiler tool, we have our source map. We want to go to our working directory and select my first map. And now all of the stuff that we set up here, when we hit compile, it should go through this whole sequence. And that's the QBSP, which will process these blocks and turn them into their more complex triangles. Then there's the viz process, which will determine visibility and occlusion and help with performance. And then it will do a lighting pass if we have any point lights, which currently we don't, so it will kind of skip that step or do a full bright option. So let's go ahead and compile, and there's a shortcut for that, but we can also just activate it from here. Oh, let me turn pause on for this so that we can see all the steps. Let me have a little coffee. Okay, so one of the benefits of pausing is that it lets us see the warnings as we go along. So first thing is there is no info player deathmatch, and that means that you can't play this map in deathmatch. That's a problem considering that all maps should be viable for deathmatch. Not all are, but it's generally a good practice. It's also saying, hey, there's no WAD, there's no texture package. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we get warning that, I'm not sure about this one, no entities in empty space. Okay, but texture TB empty not found because there's no base texture. And it's trying to fill it in with something, but it doesn't know what to use. So now if we go to viz, everything looks correct. It's nice and happy. And if we go to lighting, it has 0 empty light maps. And everything is happy considering that there are no lights in the map. Okay, so now that we've done that and successfully compiled our map, we should be able to verify just by going to the id1 directory and maps and see, hey, there's my first map.bsp. The .bsp is the compiled version of the map versus the thing that we're modifying, if we go over here, is a my first map .map. And when you compile, it will create duplicates just to safely store copies so that you aren't destroying your work through the process. It is kind of like baking a cake in the sense that the .map is the cake batter and the .bsp is the cake, but it doesn't destroy the batter in the process of making the cake. Like we still get a copy, we can still modify. But now that we verified that the compile works, we can now run Quake. And this will kick us into the map, and you can see, oh no, there's no texture. This is real bad. But we do have our rooms, and we can walk around. And we have this very basic first map. And this is probably doing hell to the stream video compression, so I'm gonna stop that and move on with the next step. Any questions so far with where we're at? Might want to increase the font size. Very 90s, okay. Cool, so next step, we are going to throw on some textures here. So let's see. One of the things I grabbed here is the prototype WAD by creator. And we want to drop that into our WADs directory. This is one of those things that could really go in any directory we want, but it's just nice to keep it organized this way. And now that we've dropped that in, we can go to our map, our settings up here, and go to our face settings, go to our texture collections, and add texture collection from file system, and then go to our WADs, and go to prototype.wad. And we want to set that to an absolute path. And now we can see we've got this whole bunch of nice fancy textures loaded in for us to use. So now, just to do a very quick application, you can double select. I'm just doing that by left clicking twice, and that will select everything in the world. Because right now all we have is brushes and this player. We can select everything, all of the brushes, and then deselect the player, and then grab one of these textures. And let's go with just a nice basic gray. And let's make the floors a different gray, just to help with the visibility there. Now we can compile again. I'm going to do that by Control-C. And now I'm going to run the map with Control-R. And there we go. It's no longer checkerboard land, or it's a different kind of checkerboard land, which is a little bit more pleasing. Cool. But now that we are in this map, there is nowhere for us to go. There's nothing for us to do. There's no exit. And a good Quake map needs an exit. So at this point, let's go ahead and create one. When I dropped in the player earlier, this is an entity. There are two different types of entities. We've got point entities and we've got brush entities. And if you go to the entity tab, it will list out all of the different point entities. And we can just drag and drop these in like I did with the player start. Like if I want an exploding barrel here, I can just drag and drop. And if I want there to be an enemy right here, maybe let's do a dog as well. There we go. Now I've got enemies and I've got exploding barrels. Same deal with weapons and health and all sorts of stuff. So we can drop in the nail gun. We can drop in a health pack. And there we go. And these are all point entities. But now we need to create a level exit. So at this point, I'm going to create a new brush, which you can do if you don't currently have anything selected. You can left click and drag, and that will create the floor, the X and Y of this new brush. If you then hold Alt, that will modify the vertical component of the brush. So here I've got brush. I'm going to move it against the wall here. And I want this to be a brush entity, and it is going to be a trigger, and it is going to change levels. So now if I deselect it, you'll see that it's kind of translucent, and that's because I believe when we compile, this won't actually be rendered. Because it's a trigger, it's not going to be considered for the visual of the space. So for this entity, we have a set of properties up here. And these are key value pairs. And basically you can think of it as, hey, here's a property name and here is a value that we can set it to. So in this case, we have a map property, which is, hey, the map that we're going to go to when we trigger the change level. So let's go to the start map. All right, and now let's go ahead and compile. Again, that's Control C. And now let's run, Control R. And now we can see we've got our point entities in the map, we've got our nail gun, we've got our enemies, we've got our exploding barrel. And yep, didn't draw anything, but if we walk into it, changes the level. And now it will spit us back out in the start map. Cool. So everything is working correctly. But if you aren't the designer, how are you going to know that this is a change level? How do you know that's level end? So let's just do a really basic thing here and put some framing around it. Real fancy. Gorgeous. Now people are going to look at that and think, maybe that's a thing. We could do a better job with it, but it's not the highest priority right now. Another thing just to stay organized is with your triggers, there is a texture in here called trigger, and each WAD generally has a texture called trigger so that you can use it, and it just helps keep things organized and clear when you're building a level, that it's not like an illusionary wall or some other weird thing, that it's, yep, that's a trigger. Cool. I think next thing to do, let's add in some lights. So lights are point entities. I've just scrolled by it a couple times. And basically it will create a light source at this point and will behave kind of like a real light does. We've got some options that we can modify, especially with those modern compiling tools that we're using, to make the light behave in a lot more complex way than the 1996 lighting. But for now, let's just drop in a couple lights and see what happens. So now I'm going to compile again. And this time when we get to lighting, we can see that we have 5 lights. There are 0 suns in use. And we can see we've got some light map data being generated. Now if we run, we can see, hey, we've got lighting now. All right, so now I want to explain the viz process a little bit. I kind of hand waved what's going on there, but if we do our, I always forget if this is show tries or draw tries. Okay, it's show tries. You can see that we've got triangles built out for everything in the map, or at least everything that's currently being drawn in the map. And that whole second room we've got over there isn't being drawn. But as we approach it, we are passing some view portal that says, this is going to be visible soon, so I should start drawing. And that is a way to help us break the map up into chunks so it's more performant and you aren't drawing the whole map all at once, all these triangles. And with more detailed, more complex modern maps, that kind of it just helps. I could pull up an example from like Arcane Dimensions and those levels where if it was drawing the whole map at once, it would be kind of nasty even on modern computers. But now a common problem that we run into with vizzing is like maybe we say, hey, I want an open sky. I want this big view into the void, right? And if this was Unity or Unreal Engine 4, what I've done is totally valid, right? Like I could, this is basically just a block, right? And if I do this, now you can see I'm getting a warning though, which says, hey, no vizzing performed. And there are some problems here. What this is referred to is a leak in the level. In this case, this is a very big leak because we've got a huge amount of space that we've opened up. Basically, in Quake levels, there is, if we have an open sky or sky open to the void, it doesn't know how to calculate that visiting process. And we'll see that in a second here when I run the map, that now, like, sure, it's open to the void, sort of. But if I show tries, we can see everything is drawing at once because it doesn't know how, it doesn't have a way to calculate what should be drawn, what shouldn't be drawn. So what we actually want to do here is create a sky. So in our WOD, we have sky 1 and sky 2. Let's go ahead and use sky 2 because that's kind of a fun, nasty green color to it. And basically we want to seal off the map as if it is interiors, as if it has a ceiling. And before I compile this, I'm just going to run this again, and I'm going to use the noclip command, and I'm also going to, let's see, so I'm going to do full bright, I think. Yeah, so full bright basically draws all the textures at their default value. It basically ignores the light map information and draws them at full brightness. So we've got noclip, which means that we can now fly around and we won't collide with the environment. And you can see, like, again, this looks basically how it looks in our level editor. Like, these look like building blocks that are combining to create this interior and exterior space. But now, if we finish sealing up this level here, let's go ahead and just close this off again. And now let's compile. And now let's go ahead and run. Now we can see if we do the same thing, our full bright 1 and noclip. Now when you fly out here, we don't see any of those blocks that we have. Like, what we see is just the interior faces of these blocks. We aren't seeing any of this stuff. Like, this guy could be out to here, or it could be all the way in here, and it wouldn't make a difference. And that's kind of a tricky paradigm to wrap your head around. That's something that is a little unusual for modern tools, but it's one of the things about Quake that it's just the way it works. But importantly, if we want to create those big void maps, there are ways for us to do that. Some of them are more efficient than others, but like if we wanted to have that map that I had earlier, we could create this whole sky situation. And have it go all the way around if I correctly control drag here. There we go. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is select both these guys. I'm going to duplicate by hitting Control D, and now I'm going to rotate by hitting Alt and my arrow keys. Okay. Now I'm going to duplicate the floor and use that as a ceiling, like that. And let's go ahead and delete these guys for now. Now if I compile and I run, and noclip and full bright, we can see it's back to being the way it is in editor as these big blocks, but now with this giant void around it. And that's because this is basically behaving like a room. This is one way for us to make void maps, but we do run into the problem again of, it doesn't really help us with the performance side of things. Like, it still doesn't know, hey, can I safely hide that room over there, or is the player going to be able to see it really briefly? And it makes it so it's still being drawn. So yeah, that is basically what the Vising tool does. The Vising tool helps figure out what is and isn't inside the gameplay space and what can be ignored. So if we go back to just having a ceiling over the level, and get rid of these. And close my duplicate copies running, and compile, and run. What Vising is doing is figuring out, hey, I don't need these back faces. Maybe it's QBSP that's doing that. I forget which step exactly, but it is a combination of those compile tools that is giving us this cake instead of this cake batter. Cool. So any questions up to this point? I haven't been really watching chat, but okay, so Shambler Not had a question about using a hint brush. I used a change level trigger. Okay, Ball clarifies that yes, the viz is just for clarifying what is visual and what was being rendered, and the QBSP is what figures out if these back faces should be drawn or not, or should be included in rendering. All right. So I think next thing up, let's add a skylight. It's maybe getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but that's kind of a fun thing to do. We've been at this for about 40 minutes and have covered a lot of the fundamentals, but let's do something a little bit fun that definitely wasn't possible or would have been very difficult to do successfully in Quake in '96, but is now very easy to do with these modern tools. So I'm going to say that this light is the sun. And to do this, we need to create a new property that is in this point entity's properties. So to do this, we can hit the plus to create a new property and say sun. And we know about this because of Eric W.'s, let me go ahead and so Eric W.'s tools is what allows for these settings that we're going to be using. The older compilers wouldn't have allowed for this stuff. So it's fancy modern stuff that we're doing, which is what makes it tricky. So we're saying this light is the sun. We're going to set that to 1 to say, hey, is this the sun? Yes, it is. It's true. And we are going to give this a direction to be facing. Right now, if we just built lighting as is, it would be pointing in a default direction, which would be like right along the horizon, and we wouldn't even see it dipping into the level here. So what we want to do is create another point entity, which is an info null. And the difference between an info null and an info not null is whether they get preserved in the actual level itself. The info null gets culled out during the compile process. It's really only useful for giving information to these other entities. So in this case, we've got our light, and the light is looking at a target. This is basically to say, what is this pointing to? And in this case, we're going to call it sun target. We could call it whatever we want. And our info null is going to have the target name sun target. And we can see we now have this line drawing between them with an arrow pointing from the one to the other, which says, hey, this thing is paying attention to this thing. And that also tells us what direction the sunlight is going to be facing. So we can adjust this and say, I think I want the sun to do maybe something like that. Maybe something like that. Sure. And now we've got our basic sun. Let me make sure that we've deleted out the other lights. Yep. The important thing with the sun is that it does need a sky texture. If we didn't have a sky in here, then it wouldn't know where the sun should be coming from in the first place. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at basically every point of the sky and use it as a source for this directional light. So now if I compile, we can see that we have one light and one sun in use. And now we've got our nice sunlit map. But you know, it's still, we've got these really stark shadows. This is still pretty dark. So maybe we should modify that. Again, looking at Eric W.'s tools and some of the nice features that are possible with modern Quake, we can turn on various forms of bounce scale to get sort of fake bounce lighting and brighten up the shadows as if it was a real light. So to do that, with our compiler graphical user interface, that setting isn't visible by default, but what you can do is right click and add another setting. What we want to do is set bounce 1, which means that bounce is true. I think that's the right one. We'll see soon enough that is not the right one. Now let's compile. And now let's run. Yeah, and we can see we've now got, where it was previously pitch black, we now have these nice subtle shadows bouncing in. And to make this even more apparent, we could turn on light map mode. And what this is doing is it's, instead of drawing the textures, it's just drawing the light map data. And we can see that it's now being filled in with this bounce light. And I think what's basically doing is creating little point lights around the surface for it to fill in the bounce area. We are still getting some jaggies and some rough edges, and there are ways for us to improve that. Let me go ahead and turn light map 1 to off. Yeah, let's go ahead and do a few more little fun things. Let's see first if there are any questions. Bounce and dirt to world spawn instead of compiler settings. Yes, that is a useful thing. You can also set the sun to be, instead of having a point in space and having it point toward an info null, you could set that information in here with your sun mangle and sunlight. I find it's useful to actually have it physically in space so I can see what kind of angle it's coming in at rather than modifying a number and not being totally sure. It does say, you know, the mangle is the yaw, pitch, roll, so you can kind of mentally figure it out, but it's a little trickier than having it here to visualize. But let's, you know, a couple more fun things to do. Let's add some color to our light. And that's another one of those properties of modern tools that was not possible in 96. And let's select a color that looks a little bit like this kind of nasty green sky that we've got going. Yeah, something like that. Maybe let's make it a little more subtle though. Okay. And now let's also add in fog just for fun. And in this case, I currently don't have any entity selected. When I don't have anything selected, I have instead the world spawn selected, which is basically everything that, all the brushes, all the environment, the whole level is kind of the world spawn. So with the fog, we have 4 properties, or 4 values. One of them is the density, and then the rest are the color. So let's go ahead and just grab this value here as the color. So what I did there is I hit escape to deselect, which let me get back to the world spawn information. So now I can paste in these 3 numbers. Let's go ahead and just shorten it up so it's a little bit easier to see. We've got 0.95, we've got a 1, and we've got, let's just call that a 0.8. And that is our red, green, and blue. We need to put a density in front, so let's do 0.04. And now we've got some fog. So if we compile and we run, now you can see we've got fog. And we also have nice kind of nasty green light. And like, dang, this is from 96, but we're already doing some pretty neat stuff here. And we could also, if we want to, I think it's sky fog. I think that's what it is. I'm blanking on the term for it, but there's a way for us to make it so that the sky is still at a different level of fogginess than the rest of the level. We could also adjust the fog density here. So if we want to really crank it up, we could do, what did I do that time? There we go. Yeah, now we're in Silent Hill. Or, you know, back to something more subtle, like that, where it's just softly tinting the level. And through the portal, and back to our start map. All right, well, we're coming up on 50 minutes, almost an hour now, so do we have any questions? Oh, I had a capital R, that's the problem. If I did lowercase r sky fog, yeah. So one thing that I meant to mention earlier, but I forgot about, is once you have a map in the id1 maps directory, you can just type maps and it will let you know what maps are currently accessible with the game that you're using. And that means that I can now type my first map. And did I enter it wrong? Oh, I hit a J at the end. There we go. So yeah, that's a way to load into the map without using the compiler. And now we can do sky fog. Yeah, there we go. We're gonna do that if we really wanted to, be wild and crazy. All right. So I think what we have so far is pretty basic in terms of gameplay. We've got nail gun, we've got some enemies, we've got some exploding barrels. Next step would be to create some kind of combat encounter as a way of, you know, basically creating a roller coaster of experience from the start of the level to the exit. And often pairing that with some kind of story or some kind of progression through the level creates a really interesting and memorable level. And I think that's something that we can dig into a little bit with next time. But are there any questions with the basics, setting up TrenchBroom with the compiler or folder structure or any of that stuff? So far, sounds like it's all good. Cool. Well, then I think I might call the stream here for now. And then depending on what more comes up or if there are questions later, I might do another stream later today or write up the next phase of the tutorial and stream that when that's ready. All right. Well, thank you all for dropping by, and hopefully that helped clarify things. And if you have any questions, let me know. Cool. See you all around.